She thought tonight was the beginning. It was, just not in any way she could have imagined. The blood moon hung above the Thornridge clearing like a wound in the sky, deep red, ancient, full. The kind of moon that made wolves press their palms to their chests and feel something stir beneath the bone. Once every generation, it rose over this clearing, and when it did, the goddess revealed her will. Fated bonds were confirmed. Chosen mates were named. Lives were permanently, irrevocably changed. For Elowyn Silvermore, who had spent 18 years being overlooked, underestimated, and quietly set aside, this was supposed to be the night the world finally saw her. She stood at the back of the clearing in a clean white dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her pale gray eyes wide and warm, and full of a hope she had been carrying for 2 years without telling a single soul. She did not know that someone was watching her from the shadows. She did not know about the pair of gold eyes burning in the dark above the platform. Still, patient, ancient in a way the night itself was not. She did not know that the air around that shadow was older and heavier than the rest of the world, like standing at the edge of a continent and feeling the weight of everything that had existed before you. She only knew the warmth in her chest. She only knew tonight. She was wrong about what tonight meant. But what happened next? No one in the Thornridge pack would ever forget. The drums began at dusk. They were low at first, barely a vibration in the soles of Elowyn's thin shoes, pressed against the cold grass at the back of the clearing. Then they built, slow and ceremonial, rolling through the pine trees like something waking up from a very long sleep. The smell of pine smoke drifted over the crowd. Hundreds of wolves gathered in the clearing, their breath misting in the cold air, the heat of their combined bodies doing little against the mountain chill. Somewhere near the front, a child laughed and was quickly hushed. Elowyn twisted her fingers together and breathed. She had been to 3 blood moon ceremonies in her life. The first 2 she'd watched from this same back edge of the clearing, too young for the bond to matter, watching older wolves get claimed and wondering what it felt like. The third time, 2 years ago, she'd stood here and felt something she hadn't expected. A warmth. Quiet and deep and entirely unlike anything she'd ever felt before. A pressure beneath her ribs, like a hand pressed gently against her sternum from the inside. A pull, faint but steady, like a thread of silver connecting her chest to something she couldn't see. She'd pressed her palm flat against the front of her dress that night, and stood very still, afraid to breathe too loudly in case it disappeared. It hadn't disappeared. It had stayed. For 2 years. Through every cold morning and every dismissal and every moment someone in the pack looked straight through her, that warmth had stayed. She had never spoken it aloud. Not once. Omegas weren't supposed to speak their hopes aloud. It gave other people too easy a target. But she knew what it was. She had known for 2 years. Brevin Ironshade. She hadn't let herself think his name too directly, the way you don't stare directly at the sun. Future alpha of the Thornridge pack. Broad-shouldered and certain of himself in the way that only someone born to authority ever truly was. She had memorized the sound of his voice without trying, low and even and carrying across any room. She had memorized the way he laughed without meaning to. Rare, genuine, something that broke through the authority like light through a crack. She had never spoken more than a dozen words directly to him. She didn't need to. The bond spoke for her, and it had been speaking for 2 years. And tonight, the goddess would make it real. She was trying not to let hope become expectation. She knew what happened when Omegas expected too much. A small hand found hers in the dark. Tonight's the night. Serena Ashenford was small and quiet and had the kind of warm brown eyes that made you feel like nothing in the world was actually as terrible as you'd thought. She had been Elowyn's only real friend since childhood. A beta, steady and gentle, with the ability to read Elowyn's silences with an accuracy that should have been frightening, and was instead just deeply comforting. Elowyn managed to smile. Maybe. Not maybe. Serena squeezed her hand. You've been carrying this for 2 years. Tonight it becomes real." Elowyn nodded and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say, and because she was afraid that too many words might crack the careful, fragile shell she'd built around her heart. Her gaze drifted. She hadn't meant it to, as it just did, toward the front of the clearing. Vianne Silvermore stood in the first rank of the assembled pack, near the fire circle, among the ranked wolves and the warrior class, and the people whose names were remembered. She was wearing something new, a deep burgundy dress that caught the firelight and made her skin look golden. Her dark hair was swept up in a way that must have taken someone an hour to arrange. She was laughing at something a tall warrior had said, her head tilting back slightly, her hand resting on his arm the way Vianne's hands always found their way to arms, without quite asking, but with absolute certainty of welcome. Elowyn watched her sister for a moment. She looked away. There was a memory she tried not to visit very often. The night 2 years ago, when the warmth had first arrived, and Elowyn had made the mistake of letting herself say it out loud. Just once. Just to her sister, sitting in the kitchen of their parents' house, their mother already asleep and the fire burning low. She'd said it so quietly, so carefully, almost like asking permission. She'd said she thought she'd felt something, a bond, at the ceremony. She thought it might be Brevin. Vianne had looked at her for a long moment. Then she'd laughed. Not cruelly. That was the thing that made it worse. Not with malice. With that particular flavor of older sister's certainty that carries all the authority of experience and none of its kindness. Omegas don't get fated alphas, Elowyn. That's not how the goddess works. You must have felt a ghost bond, a reflection of someone else's. Stop dreaming. She'd pushed it down. She'd kept dreaming anyway. Alone and silent and careful for 2 years. The drums changed tempo. A deeper note joined them, resonant and final, the note that meant the ceremony was beginning in earnest. Heads turned toward the stone platform at the center of the clearing. Elder Jorvik Grimvale climbed the steps, old and broad-shouldered even now, his white hair catching the moonlight, the mark of 40 years of ceremony on his face. He raised his hands, and the crowd went still like a single held breath. "Children of Thornridge," his voice carried without effort, the voice of a man who had been the loudest sound in this clearing for 4 decades. The blood moon rises. The goddess watches. Let those who carry bonds come forward and be known. The air shifted. Elowyn felt the warmth in her chest flare. Then the drums fell silent. And Brevin Ironshade stepped into the center of the clearing. He moved the way future alphas move. Not hurried, not performing, just entirely certain that every eye would follow and entirely unbothered by it. He was wearing the dark ceremonial collar of the Ironshade line, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set. The pack leaned toward him slightly without realizing it, the way wolves always lean toward the strongest thing in the room. Even Elowyn, at the back of the clearing, felt the magnetic pull of it. Him. Proximity. The bond screaming in her chest like a fire catching dry wood. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. He was scanning the crowd. She watched his eyes move through the assembled pack, slowly, steadily, from the front rank backward. They moved through the warrior class, through the betas, and through the ranked families and the unmarked wolves and the children at the edge. They reached the back of the clearing. They found her. Brevin Ironshade held Elowyn Silvermore's gaze for 3 full seconds. The world went quiet. The drums were gone. The cold was gone. The crowd was gone. There was only the silver thread in her chest pulling taut and warm and certain, and his eyes across the clearing, finding her in the dark at the back of the world where she had always stood. She let herself breathe. She let herself hope. She should have looked more carefully at his expression. She should have noticed the thing that was wrong, the flatness beneath it, the calculation that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with decision. She should have noticed that the face of a man finding his fated doesn't look like that, how it doesn't look resolved. It doesn't look like a problem being confirmed. She noticed none of it. She noticed only the warmth and the gaze and the silver thread, and the way his lips were already moving around the shape of her name. Tonight, she thought. Her whole heart was in it. She was wrong. Elowyn Silvermore. Her name in his voice. In this clearing, in front of everyone. She heard the whispers start immediately. An Omega? She watched heads turn. Toward her, then back toward Brevin, then back to her again, calculating. She felt it, the weight of their attention, the way it sat on her shoulders like stones. But she lifted her chin. She squared her shoulders. She walked forward on legs that were shaking so badly she had to concentrate on every step. And she held her chin up because that was the only thing she had, and she would not give it up. Serena made a small, joyful sound behind her. A sound like relief. The clearing parted for her. The wolves stepped back, just barely, just enough, creating a path to the fire circle where Brevin stood waiting. The cold grass gave way to the packed earth of the sacred ground. Torchlight fell on her face. She stepped into the center, into the firelight and the moonlight and the ancient silence of the ceremony, and she stood before him. She looked at him. He looked at her. The bond in her chest was screaming. Screaming mate. Screaming yes. Screaming finally. Her whole body was warm with it, and she felt the silver thread go taut and real and visible in a way it hadn't been before, like a rope pulled tight between 2 points. She waited for it, and she waited for the recognition in his face, the soft collapse of it, the light that was supposed to come into a man's eyes when he found his fated. His eyes were wrong. She saw it in the second before he spoke. The wrongness of them, cold and flat and purposeful. Not the warm collision of two souls recognizing each other, but the steady regard of someone who has made a decision and is following through. He was not looking at her the way a man finds his home. He was looking at her the way a man closes a door. He turned toward the pack before he spoke to her. Not to her, to them. His voice was smooth and rehearsed, and carried to every corner of the clearing without the slightest tremor. The Thornridge pack deserves strength at its alpha's side. It deserves a Luna of rank and standing, one who can face what this pack will become. A bond is sacred. He paused, and she could see him choosing his next words with care, with precision, with the practiced timing of someone who has rehearsed this. But not every bond is right. The goddess gives us fate. She also gives us choice. He looked at her, directly, fully, for the first time since she'd walked into the circle. I will not be bound by a mistake. The silence that followed was absolute. The pain hit her 3 full seconds after the words. It was not grief, not the way she had always imagined grief would feel. It was physical. A tearing, brutal and total, starting in her chest where the warmth had lived for 2 years and ripping outward. Like a root pulled from the ground. Like a limb separated from a body. She gasped. She couldn't stop it. The sound came out of her before she had any control. And her knees gave. And she went down, catching herself on one hand and one knee in the packed earth of the sacred ground. Her other hand pressed against her chest because the pain was there, right there, a wound without blood. The clearing gasped with her. She heard it. She was aware of it, distantly. The sound of hundreds of wolves responding to the desecration of something sacred. A bond publicly severed. A ceremony turned into a verdict. She looked up through the blur of tears. Brevin had already turned away. He raised his voice. The wolf I choose. A pause, deliberate, the pause of a theater performance. Is one worthy of what this pack demands. And from the front rank, Vianne stepped forward. She had prepared for this. Elowyn could see it. The new dress, the arranged hair, the walk that spoke of practice, the smile that spoke of anticipation. Vianne walked to the center of the sacred ground with the ease of someone walking toward something they had already been promised. She took Brevon's offered hand. She stood beside him and the pack began to applaud. Slowly at first, then building, then all at once, the sound crashing through the clearing like a wave. Elowyn was still on one knee in the dirt. She looked up. Vianne was looking at her. Over Brevon's shoulder, holding her sister's broken gaze with her chin slightly lifted and her eyes perfectly, terribly calm. And then Vianne smiled. Just barely. Small, private, the corners of her mouth curving with the satisfaction of something that had gone exactly as planned. You never had a chance. 2 wounds, then. One where the bond had been ripped away. One older and deeper and more personal, and in the place where sisters are supposed to be safe. Elowyn's strength left her. She didn't choose it. It simply went. The thing that had been holding her upright, hope, the bond, the 2-year weight of believing, released all at once, and she went down, her cheek against the cold earth, her hand still pressed against her chest, the applause of the pack washing over her like a tide rising above her head. Cold ground. Cold and dark, and the sound of celebration above her. This is it, some part of her thought. This is the end of the story I thought I was living. Then the applause died. Not slowly, not gradually. Instantly, cut, severed, silenced as though a hand had pressed down on the sound itself. One moment it was there, the bright and terrible sound of her sister's triumph, and then it was simply gone. And what replaced it came from the stone platform to her right. Low, resonant, ancient, a sound that didn't live in the air. It lived in the chest, in the base of the spine, in the oldest and most fundamental part of the wolf that existed beneath the human shape. It was not a word. It was not a command. It was not anything that could be spoken or named. It was a warning. Every wolf in the Thornridge clearing felt it settle into their bones like a weight from above. Every wolf understood, without having been told, that something far more powerful than an alpha had just decided to speak. Elowyn, lying in the dirt, heard it and felt it, and did not have the strength to lift her head. But she felt the air change above her. She felt something coming. Before anyone saw him, they felt him. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, and not like winter arriving, but the way a shadow falls across warm ground. Gradual and certain and impossible to stop. Every wolf in the clearing felt a pressure they couldn't name settle onto their shoulders, into their chests, behind their eyes. It didn't ask permission. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, the way a storm arrives. You understand it only when you're already in it. The Omegas sank to their knees first, without understanding why. The way their bodies understood submission before their minds did. Then the Betas, some of them, the ones whose instincts ran old and deep. Then the warriors began to bow their heads, one by one, a falling motion moving through the crowd like grain flattening in wind. Elder Jorvik Grimvale, who had led this pack through 3 generations of alphas, pressed his knee to the ground with the weight of a man who has lived long enough to know when something larger than himself has entered the room. Brevon Ironshade, for the first time in his life, felt small. He did not kneel, but he went still in the way that prey animals go still. Total, involuntary, the intelligence completely overridden by the body's older knowledge. Then Nolan stepped out of the shadow. He was tall, not abnormally so, but tall in the way that adds presence rather than mere height. He wore dark leather that absorbed the torchlight rather than reflecting it. He moved with the unhurried certainty of something that had never once in its existence needed to rush. His face was not soft and it was not cruel. It was the face of something ancient that had long since moved past the need to perform any emotion for anyone. Lines of it, carved and real, a face that had seen more centuries than the Thornridge pack had existed. And his eyes, they burned gold in the darkness. Not like firelight, Firelight flickers and dances and is always on the edge of going out. These were the eyes of embers that have been burning for hundreds of years and have not once, not for a single moment, come close to dying. They swept the clearing once. The pack, the platform, Bravan, Vian, the elder, with the complete dispassion of a man who has seen everything before. Then they found Elowin, on the ground. His jaw tightened. His gold eyes stayed on her. Not moving, not wavering, fixed on her with the total stillness of something very powerful that has chosen its direction and will not be redirected. The pack around him did not exist in that moment. Brevin Ironshade did not exist. The applause that had died was a ghost. There was only what lay in the dirt of the sacred ground, and the thing it had been made to feel. He was not the hot rage of a young man. He was not the loud fury of the humiliated. He was cold and certain, and absolutely without doubt. And the fury in his face was the kind that has been building for 1,000 years against everything that desecrates what is sacred. A fated bond had been publicly severed, in a ceremony, on sacred ground, in front of him. He began to walk toward her. The pack parted. They didn't choose it. They simply moved, because every instinct they possessed understood that the thing walking through them did not stop. He crossed the clearing in long, even strides, unhurried, unstoppable, and the wolves on either side gave way like water around stone. He reached the edge of the fire circle. He stepped onto the sacred ground. He crossed to where Elowin lay without looking at anyone else. And then, Nolan, the Alpha King, ancient and terrifying and undefeated for more centuries than any pack in the territory had existed, knelt. One knee pressed to the cold earth of the clearing, right beside her. The pack could not process it. He did not kneel. He had never been seen to kneel. Every person present understood, in the wordless way of wolves, that this was something that did not happen, had not happened, and was happening now, directly in front of them, and none of them had any category to put it in. His gloved hand moved to her face, gently, with a gentleness that looked foreign on him, the way a word sounds in a language you haven't spoken for many years but haven't forgotten. He brushed a strand of dark hair from her cold cheek. His thumb traced the line of it. His voice was low, not whispered, low, the way deep things are low. Meant for her, not for the crowd. They did this to you. She was not conscious. She did not hear him, but he said it anyway, like a witness recording something for the record, like a man making note of a debt. His hand moved to her chin, firm, careful. He cupped it and tilted her face slightly upward, and his voice, when it came, carried the full weight of centuries of command in the softest possible tone. Look at me. It bypassed her broken consciousness entirely. Her eyes opened. They were empty at first, pale gray, glassy, the eyes of someone whose light has just been extinguished, whose hope has just been publicly destroyed in front of everyone they know. She was looking without seeing. The world was still dark and cold and merciless. And then her eyes found his. The world ended. Then it remade itself, from the center outward, beginning at the place where their gazes met and expanding, warm, golden, enormous, like a sunrise happening all at once instead of over hours. It slammed into them both like a wave that had been gathering for 1,000 years and had finally found the shore it was meant for. Not a hum, not a thread, not the quiet warmth she'd carried for 2 years for someone who didn't deserve it. A detonation. Elowin gasped. A real breath. A full breath. A living breath. The tearing agony of Brevin's rejection, which had been everything, the whole of her world, 30 seconds ago, was simply gone, incinerated so completely it left no scar. In its place, warmth so vast it didn't feel like emotion. It felt like weather, like standing in full sunlight after years in a room with no windows. She stared up at him. She had no words. She had no thoughts. She had only the golden warmth expanding through every part of her, and his eyes, burning and ancient and fixed on her with an expression she couldn't name, because she had never seen it before, had never had occasion to learn what it looked like when a 1,000-year-old king is thoroughly and completely surprised. Because Nolan was surprised. He had lived centuries. He had moved through this world like a fixed point while everything else changed. Packs rose and fell, bloodlines merged and died, and the world reshaped itself around him, and he adapted and endured and continued. He had long since stopped believing she existed. The mate bond was a legend for him, something he'd watched other wolves experience with the detached interest of an observer, something he'd privately concluded the goddess had not chosen to give him, and had made his peace with that fact across 2 or 3 centuries. And here she was, broken and trembling in the dirt of a Pax clearing, smelling of winter pine and dormant fire and a power that had been sleeping inside her bones, waiting. He understood it instantly, the way the bond makes you understand, waiting all her life for something worthy enough to call it awake. His queen, in this dirt. He rose to his feet. His gold eyes moved across the clearing, slowly, deliberately, touching everything and everyone. Breven Ironshade, standing where he'd left Elowin in the dirt, his face now white and unreadable. Vianne Silvermore beside him, the new dress, the arranged hair, the smile that had already begun to falter. Elder Jorvik, still on one knee. The pack, frozen, watching. His voice when it came was not loud. It didn't need to be. "In your arrogance," Nolan said, looking at nothing in particular, and meaning all of them. "You delivered her to me." The clearing was absolutely silent. Somewhere in the dark forest at the edge of the territory, a night bird called once and went quiet. Elowin, still on the ground, looked up at the figure standing over her, his gold eyes burning against the dark sky, the blood moon above and behind him like a seal. And she understood in the marrow of her bones, and that her story had not ended tonight. It had just become something she could not have imagined. For a moment, Elowin couldn't move. The warmth of the bond was still spreading through her, slow and steady and enormous, filling in every place that Breven's rejection had emptied, like warmth returning to cold hands. She was still on the ground. The cold earth was still under her palms. The smell of pine smoke and damp grass was still in her lungs. Everything was the same. Everything was different. Then Nolan was beside her again, one knee on the ground, his arm moving around her shoulders, not pulling her upright, not commanding, but offering support, steadiness, the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. She let him help her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady at first, trembling with the aftermath of everything, and she felt the bond pulse with warmth as though offering itself as a current to run through her veins and keep her standing. She became aware of everything differently, all at once, in a way she hadn't been before. The colors in the clearing were sharper, the smells overwhelming in their specificity. The sour fear coming off the nearest pack wolves, the cold pine of the forest, the ancient stone smell of the platform, and underneath all of it, surrounding her, a scent that belonged to the man beside her. Dark wood and cold air, and something like embers. Old. Real. Hers. She stood up straight. She didn't choose to. Her spine simply decided. She was still Elowin Silvermore, Omega of the Thornridge Pack, in her clean, white dress at the back of the world. She knew that. She hadn't forgotten it. But something about standing beside him, and with the golden warmth of the bond moving through her blood, made it feel like a description that was already becoming past tense. Then Breven moved. She heard him before she saw him. A sound that was half his voice and half something older and animal. The too late response of an alpha whose instincts had finally caught up with what his ambition had just cost him. His footsteps were fast, crossing the sacred ground, his hand already reaching. She was supposed to... His voice broke slightly. I made a mistake. Nolan moved. He didn't shout. He didn't snarl. He simply stepped between them. One step, completely unhurried, and raised one hand. A single gesture. Open palm. Nothing theatrical about it. The pulse of dominance that followed was not visible. It was felt. Every wolf in the clearing felt it. A pressure wave that passed through them like wind through tall grass. And Brevin, future alpha of the Thornridge pack, born to authority, trained to command, flew backward off his feet. He landed in the dirt 2 meters back with a sound of impact that seemed very loud in the absolute silence of the clearing. He sat in the dirt where Elowin had been. He stared up at the king. Nolan didn't look at him again. He had already turned back to Elowin. She looked at him. He was watching her with those gold eyes, steady and unreadable, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. Loud, quick, not quite fear. Something adjacent to fear, but warmer. Something that knew the difference between danger and intensity, and understood this was the second thing. His hand moved to her jaw. Not grabbing. Finding. The way you find something you've been looking for. His fingers curved along the line of her face with a precision that was entirely deliberate, tilting her chin slightly, turning her head just enough to expose the curve of her neck. His gold eyes asked a question his voice didn't speak. She understood it. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The bond sang in her veins, warm and golden and absolutely certain. A song she realized she already knew every word to, had always known. The way you recognize music you've never heard and still feel like a memory. She didn't look away. His eyes held hers for 3 full seconds. Then, you are mine. Not a command, not a question, a confirmation. The way you confirm something that has already been true for longer than either of you has been in the room. She nodded once. That was all. But that was enough. He marked her. The moment his mark settled into her skin, the clearing went white. Not a candle flicker. Not a soft light. A wave, gold and ancient and enormous, that burst from the curve of Elowin's neck and swept outward across the entire clearing in a single heartbeat. Every wolf present threw their arms up or stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. Some fell to their knees. The trees at the edge of the clearing shuddered as though a wind had passed through them, though there was no wind. When the light faded, there was silence. Then, in the silence, a soft glow. Elowin could feel it before she saw it, warm, pulsing gently, living in her skin at the curve of her neck. She raised her fingers and touched it without thinking. Warm, real, intricate. She could feel the lines of it under her fingertips, and a mark that was nothing like the simple claim marks she had seen on other wolves. She would learn later what it looked like. The sweeping lines of an ancient royal seal, woven through with something that resembled the phases of the moon, glowing softly gold against her skin. The mark of a queen. Nolan lifted his head. He looked at her, and in the space between one breath and the next, in that small silence after the light, and before the world reassembled itself, something happened in his face. The hard lines of it shifted. Not softened, exactly. Not collapsed into anything easy. But shifted. The way old stone shifts when the ground beneath it moves. Something underneath the authority, underneath the ancient calculation, that was almost tender. Welcome back, he murmured. Low, private, an inside voice, not a king's voice. A voice that belonged to the balcony conversation, not the throne room. As if she had been somewhere for a very long time. As if he had been waiting. Elowin breathed. She turned. The clearing arranged itself in her vision. Everyone frozen. Everyone watching. Brevin, sitting in the dirt where she had been, hollow-faced and empty in a way that looked final. The way things look when they've been broken, and both people know no repair is coming. Vianne, standing where she'd been standing, her golden dress dimmed in the aftermath of the light, her face white, her eyes fixed on Elowin with something that had lost all its calculation and become something rawer and smaller. Elowin looked at Vianne. She expected to feel something large, anger, grief, the burning need to say something that would land correctly. She waited for it. On what she felt was clean, quiet distance, like standing at the top of a hill and looking down at a valley you used to live in. She could see all of it clearly. She just wasn't in it anymore. She turned her back. She didn't slam any doors. She didn't speak any final words. She simply turned around, and the turning was its own complete sentence. From the tree line they came. She hadn't seen them arrive. Nolan's guard, materializing from between the pines like shadows given shape. 6 of them, at least, moving with the silent precision of wolves who have spent centuries learning to move without being heard. They wore dark leather marked with a gold insignia she would later come to know as the seal of the Ironhold, and they formed a perimeter around the clearing's edge with the calm efficiency of people who do this regularly, and have never once found it difficult. Zarek, Nolan's head guard, broad and silver-eyed, with the kind of face that doesn't need to make threats because the face itself is the threat, posted himself at the edge of the sacred ground and swept the pack with a single, unhurried glance that communicated exactly how concerned he was about any possible resistance. The answer was, not at all. Nolan offered Elowin his arm. Formal, deliberate, the gesture of a king in public, the arm extended at the correct angle, offering rather than demanding. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. His arm was steady under her hand, solid and real and warm with the bond, and she felt the pulse of it as her fingers found the crook of his elbow, steady and sure like a heartbeat. They walked forward together, toward the tree line, toward the dark road out of the clearing. His stride adjusted without comment to match hers. She did not look back. Not at Brevin in the dirt. Not at Vianne with her white face. Not at the pack that had whispered about her for 18 years. She kept her chin up and her shoulders straight and her eyes forward, and she walked out of the Thornridge clearing with the Alpha King's arm under her hand, and behind her the torches burned, and the blood moon watched from above, and the pack stood in silence with nothing to applaud. At the edge of the crowd, pressed back against the pine trees with both hands covering her mouth, Serena Ashenford watched Elowin go, and smiled through her tears. The Ironhold was carved into a mountain. Elowin had known this. Everyone knew this, in the way wolves know things about the Alpha King that have passed down through generations because they were too significant to forget. She had known it as information. She had not understood what it meant until she stood before it. The gate was black stone and iron, set into the mountainside as though the mountain had grown around it, as though it had been there since the mountain was young. The road that led to it had been carved from the rock face itself, wide enough for 6 wolves walking side by side, ancient enough that the stone was worn smooth by centuries of feet. Cold blue fire burned in iron brackets on either side of the entrance, not flickering the way orange fire flickers, but burning with a steady, impatient light that had been burning since before the Thornridge pack had existed. She stepped through the gate. The ceiling disappeared. She tilted her head back and looked upward and could not find where the stone ended. The great hall of the Ironhold stretched up into shadow, and the shadow continued beyond the reach of every torch on the walls. And somewhere above the shadow was the mountain itself. Black marble floors. Columns that disappeared into the dark above. Cold blue fires in the massive hearths, casting a light that illuminated everything clearly, and warmed almost nothing. Beautiful, she thought, in the way that old things that have survived everything are beautiful. Not comfortable. Not warm. Not the beauty of things built for human ease. The beauty of permanence, and the beauty of a thing that will exist long after everyone currently standing in it is gone. The court filled the hall. They had been assembled. She understood this later. Understood that Zarek had sent word ahead. And they waited in rows on either side of the central path. Hundreds of wolves in the livery of the Ironhold, watching the king return. They bowed in a long, sweeping wave as Nolan entered, heads dropping, one knee touching the ground, fluid and practiced and total. Then they looked up, and they looked at her. She felt it. The calculation in it, the rapid assessment, the thing that passed from wolf to wolf in the silent language of a court. She smelled it too. She had learned, in the clearing, that she could now smell things she hadn't been able to smell before. And what she smelled in this hall was suspicion, curiosity, and beneath both of them something colder, resistance. She kept her chin up. She kept walking. Lord Tavian Duskfall stepped forward from the right side of the hall. He was silver-haired and angular, with a face that had centuries of political intelligence written into every line of it. He was dressed in the formal black and gold of the king's court, and he moved with the absolute precision of a man who has never once in his life done anything accidentally. He stopped at the edge of the central path and inclined his head. To Nolan, not to her. "My king." His voice was careful, not hostile, not warm. The voice of a man who has learned that careful is the only permanent strategy. "We are glad of your return." He paused, barely a breath. "Your guest's arrival was not anticipated. There are preparations to consider. Arrangements to be made." She heard what he didn't say. She is a pack wolf. She is an Omega. There are reasons this should be addressed before it is formalized. Nolan's voice didn't change in volume or temperature. "She is not a guest. She is your queen. Treat her accordingly." The hall absorbed this. Then, from somewhere in the second row, a younger wolf, gold-haired, the posture of someone who has just decided he is brave. A single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Unworthy. Not loud, not dramatic, just the word, placed there, and then the speaker's eyes dropped before anyone could identify him clearly. But the word had been spoken, and it had landed on Elowin exactly as intended. A stone, a verdict, the same assessment she had heard in the Thornridge pack dressed up in formal court language. As she didn't flinch. She wanted to. Something in her chest caught and held with the old reflex. The part of her that had spent 18 years learning to be small, and to make no demands, and to expect to be told she was not enough. The part of her that Brevin had used and Vianne had confirmed. That part said, "See? It follows you everywhere." The same sentence. Spoken in different rooms by different mouths, but always the same sentence in the end. She breathed through it. Then Nolan moved. One moment he was beside her at the center of the hall. The next, he had crossed the distance to the second row with a speed that seemed mismatched with his unhurried manner, and his hand was at the young wolf's collar. He lifted him, not violently, but completely, the wolf's feet leaving the floor as though gravity had been suspended specifically for the purpose of this lesson. He held him there, off the ground, in the sight of the entire court. He waited. The young wolf understood what he was waiting for. "My apologies," the wolf said. Thin. Genuine. "I was wrong." Nolan set him down, smoothed his collar with 2 fingers, a gesture more chilling than the lift had been. Then he returned to Elowin's side without hurrying, without looking back, and continued walking toward the far end of the hall. He spoke without turning around. For the benefit of the hall. "No one will say that to her again." The hall was absolutely silent. Later, much later, when the court had dispersed, and the formalities of her arrival had been processed, and she had been shown to rooms that were larger than her family's entire house, Elowin stood on a stone balcony and looked out at the dark mountain range. The mountains went on forever. That was the first thing she understood. She had grown up on the edge of forest, with the mountains as a distant backdrop, a suggestion of permanence on the horizon. Standing on this balcony, she was inside them. They rose around the Ironhold on three sides, black against the dark sky, their edges lost in cloud. The air was thin and cold, and tasted like nothing that had ever been breathed before. She was standing there, her arms around herself against the cold, when she felt him. Not footsteps, the bond, pulling gently at her center, the golden warmth of it shifting. The way a compass needle shifts when north changes direction. She felt him before she heard him, and she heard him before she saw him, and she turned as he stepped through the open balcony door. He stood a short distance from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give her the space of her own thoughts. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The mountain wind moved between them. "Your bloodline," he said finally. Not looking at her, looking at the mountains, standing as she'd been standing. It wasn't always diminished. The Silvermore Omegas, 5 generations ago, they carried a lineage that predated the current pack structures. Power that has been suppressed, diluted, passed down in smaller and smaller portions until even the wolves who carried it didn't know it was there. She turned to look at him. What kind of power? The kind the Bond recognized. He was still looking at the mountains. The kind I recognized. Your rank was a cage built by people who didn't understand what they had. She was quiet for a moment, taking this in, setting it alongside everything she'd believed about herself for 18 years, and watching the two things sit side by side and fail to resolve. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. Quietly. She needed to know if it was the Bond, if it was obligation, if it was pity, if it was politics. He turned. His gold eyes found hers, and they were not the eyes of a king performing an answer. They were older than that, slower than that. "I am not known for kindness," he said. "I am known for being right." A brief pause. "And you, Elowyn Silvermore, are the first thing in a very long time that has made me feel something I cannot immediately explain." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a speech. It was quieter than both of those things. A private truth from a man who didn't offer private truths. She held it in her chest the way you hold something small and warm in your hands on a cold night, carefully, aware that it matters. She looked back at the mountains. After a while, he reached over. His hand found hers, and his thumb pressed once against her knuckles. Not a grip, not a claim, just a contact. Brief, real. As if confirming that she was actually here, actually standing on this balcony, actually his. Then he went inside, and she heard his footsteps cross the stone floor and grow distant. And she stood in the cold mountain air with the Bond glowing quietly in her chest, and tried to understand that she was safe. And that safety, for the first time in her life, felt like it might last. In the Thornridge Pack house, the moon was an ordinary pale crescent. Vianne Silvermore sat at a cracked mirror in a room that had felt smaller every day for the past 3 weeks. The burgundy dress from the ceremony was hung carefully in the back of a wardrobe she no longer opened. Brevin hadn't looked at her in 9 days. Not really looked. Not the way he'd promised to look. The way that had made everything she'd done feel worth doing. The pack blamed her. She could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she walked through rooms, in the way her name no longer appeared in the natural flow of conversation, and in the way even her parents moved around her carefully, like something they were afraid of, and afraid for in equal measure. The decree had arrived 2 days ago. Official seal. Gold ink on heavy parchment. Elowyn Silvermore, formerly of the Thornridge Pack, claimed and marked by King Nolan of the Ironhold, to be crowned Queen of the Allied Packs at the next turning moon. Vianne had read it until the words blurred. She was not broken. Broken was for people who had run out of options. Vianne had not run out of options. She was incandescent, hot and focused and precise in the way that only real desperation makes a person. She had been calculating since the night of the ceremony. She had been watching. She had been thinking. She knew Nolan's weakness. Every ruler had one. And his was the ancient wounds, the knowledge that power draws false bonds, that those who pursue a king will say and do anything to reach him. He had been deceived before. Not in this generation. But there were old stories, if you knew where to look, of the people who had lied to him and paid for it, and the way those lies had settled permanently into the stone of his distrust. She picked up a pen. She wrote carefully, slowly, choosing every word with the same care she'd chosen the burgundy dress. Not too dramatic, not too obvious, just the careful voice of someone claiming to be concerned. The rejection was a manipulation. Eowyn had been performing for years, waiting for the right moment. She still loved Brevin. She was playing a longer game than anyone understood. She would be the king's ruin. She folded it. She didn't sign it. She found a wolf willing to carry it for the price of her mother's silver necklace. She sent it before sunrise. She had done this before. It had worked before. She waited. Lord Tavian entered the king's study without knocking. He had never knocked in 40 years of service and did not intend to start now, and crossed to the writing table with the parchment held between two fingers. Eowyn was present. She had been present for an hour, sitting across from the king at the long table, going over the records of her bloodline's history that he'd had retrieved from the deep archives. Books older than any pack she knew the name of, their pages crackling under careful hands, their writing faded to rust on yellowed parchment. She looked up when Tavian entered. He didn't look at her. He placed the letter in front of Nolan without comment. Except, it was left at the east gate, unsigned. I thought you should see it before it circulated. Nolan read it. He read it again. The silence in the study was complete. The kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your ears. Eowyn watched him read and watched the thing that happened to his face. She saw it. The moment the king returned. The moment the warmth of the past week. The quiet nights on the balcony. The careful private conversations. All of it drew back behind stone like a tide going out. His face became a judicial surface. Flat, unreadable, calibrated. The gold eyes, when they lifted from the page and found her, were not the eyes that had found hers on the balcony. They were measuring eyes. The eyes of a man who has lived for centuries and has been deceived before. He didn't say anything, and she felt the bond change. Not break, not tear, nothing like the brutal severing of Brevin's rejection. But cool, distant, a door closing on a room that had been warm, not slamming, just firmly and quietly shutting. She felt his side of the bond shield itself, deliberately, and the warmth that had been steady in her chest for 3 weeks became faint and uncertain. Her stomach dropped. She knew this feeling. She had felt it before, from the other side, in the Thornridge clearing, watching Brevin's face while he read the version of her that Vianne had written. The verdict delivered before the defense is offered. Is this the same story? Some part of her said. Different room, more powerful speaker. Same ending? She held very still. A trial will be called. Nolan's voice was flat and even, a voice for pronouncements. Not for her, for the room, for Tavian. Public, to be held at the Thornridge clearing at the next moon. The accusation will be heard and answered before the allied packs. Her stomach dropped further. A public trial. In the clearing where she'd been broken and remade. In front of the pack that had watched both. The thought of standing there again, this time as a defendant, while Vianne's words were read aloud. He stood. He crossed the room toward the door, and she felt him passing her, and she kept her eyes on the table, on the old books open in front of her, on the faded names of the Silvermoor women who'd come before. Then he stopped. She felt it. Him, stopping beside her. Close enough that the bond pulsed weakly through the shield he'd placed on it. She didn't look up. His hand found her chin. Gentle. Firm. At the same gesture from the clearing. Tilting her face upward until her eyes had no choice but to meet his. His gold eyes were not entirely stone. She looked for it. The thing underneath. The thing that had made a private truth on a balcony. And she found it. Barely. Underneath the judicial mask. Behind the centuries of wariness. A warmth that hadn't gone out. "Trust me," he said. 2 words. No explanation. No evidence presented. Just 2 words. And then he released her chin and walked out of the study without looking back. And she heard his footsteps go down the stone corridor until the mountains swallowed the sound. She sat alone with the old books and the cold fire and the ghost of warmth in her chest. She didn't know if she should. She thought about the balcony. She thought about his thumb against her knuckles, confirming she was real. She thought about his voice saying the first thing in a very long time that has made me feel something I cannot immediately explain. She sat up straight. She turned the page of the old book. She decided to try. The clearing was the same. The pines were the same. The cold grass was the same. The smell of the clearing, pine smoke and damp earth and the particular cold of mountain nights, was the same. Even the torches were the same, set in the same brackets, burning with the same patient orange light. Everything else was different. The moon was a pale crescent tonight, thin and cold. Nothing like the blood moon that had hung above this clearing a month ago. The allied packs had assembled, not just Thornridge, but wolves from 5 neighboring territories, their elders standing at the edges, at their presence turning the clearing into something more formal and more final than any blood moon ceremony. Hundreds of wolves, standing in silence, their breath misting in the cold air. They were all kneeling when Elowyn arrived. She hadn't asked them to. They simply did. The instinct running through the crowd like a current when Nolan entered the clearing, and with him the woman at his side who now carried his mark, and the kneeling wave passed through the assembled wolves before any single wolf could have decided to start it. Elowyn walked in beside him. Not behind him, beside him. She was wearing midnight blue velvet that moved like water when she walked, her dark hair loose, Nolan's mark glowing softly at the curve of her neck. She kept her chin level and her hands still and her eyes forward, and she was aware of every gaze in the clearing finding her face and staying there. A month ago she had walked into this same clearing in a clean white dress and shaking legs, and had not made it past the center. She walked the length of it now, and felt nothing trembling. Vianne was brought forward from the holding position near the tree line, flanked by 2 of Zarek's guards. She was still dressed beautifully. She had chosen that, Elowyn understood, had dressed this morning as though dressing for a performance, as though appearance could still do the work it had always done for her. Her chin was up. Her dark eyes were sharp. She was assessing the clearing, the crowd, the positions of everyone present, calculating still. She thought she had won something. Elowyn recognized the expression, and she had watched it across dinner tables and ceremonies for 18 years. Nolan stepped forward to the center of the clearing, not to the stone platform where the ceremony had been held, to the center, the sacred ground, the place where he had knelt in the dirt and found his queen. His voice, when he spoke, filled the clearing without effort. It always did. An accusation has been made against the queen of the allied packs. The claim is one of deception, of a false bond manufactured for political gain. He spoke without inflection, without heat, laying out the charges the way a man lays out tools before beginning work. Every accusation in this territory deserves to be heard and answered in daylight before witness. He looked at Vianne. "Present your proof." Vianne gave everything she had. Elowyn watched her, and there was something almost admirable in it. The performance of it. The way Vianne's voice found its grief. The way her eyes found the exact frequency of betrayed sincerity. She wept in the way of someone who has practiced weeping, not ugly, not ragged, but photogenic and precise. She spoke of Elowyn's ambition, of years of watching and waiting, of a calculated approach to a king too ancient and too lonely to question a bond that arrived too conveniently. She painted Elowin as a master of patience, a wolf who had understood that the best way to reach a king was to be publicly broken first. It was magnificent. Every word of it was a lie. And it was magnificent. Vianne finished speaking and raised her chin and waited with the composure of someone who believes the stage is theirs. Nolan said nothing immediately. The silence lasted 3 full heartbeats. Then, "Thank you." His voice was entirely neutral. "I would now present the findings of my investigation." Zarek stepped forward. He carried a leather document case and opened it with the efficiency of someone performing a task he had completed many times. "The letter was carried by a wolf of the Ashenford territory," Nolan said. "Beta, unaffiliated with any senior pack house. He was found and interviewed 3 days after the letter's arrival." He nodded to Zarek, who produced a folded statement. "He confirms the identity of the wolf who paid him to carry the letter." Another nod. "He was paid with a silver necklace, subsequently identified as the property of the Silvermore family." Vianne went very still. "The letter claims that Elowin maintained secret correspondence with Brevin Ironshade during her time at the Ironhold. It claims they met in person 3 times in the territory between Thornridge and the Ironhold, in the weeks following the ceremony." Nolan's voice was completely unchanged. The same measured, judicial tone. "My guard maintained surveillance on Brevin Ironshade for 4 weeks following the ceremony, at my instruction. He did not leave the Thornridge pack house. He did not travel to the border territory. He did not meet with anyone outside his immediate household." The clearing held its breath. The meetings described in the letter could not have occurred. He looked at Vianne. She was no longer still. Something in her composure had fractured. Tiny, just at the edges, and the beginning of a crack running through something that had looked like stone and was revealing itself as thinner. Her eyes moved rapidly, calculating still, looking for the angle she hadn't yet seen, the move that still remained. There wasn't one. She could see it in his face, in the faces of the assembled elders, in the way the clearing had gone utterly quiet, in the way that clearings go quiet when something is over. She had the desperation of the cornered. "It worked on Brevin," she said. Her voice was sharp, cracked, stripped of performance. "Everything I said about Elowin worked on Brevin. It was supposed to work on you." The words fell into the silence and stayed there. She heard herself. She saw the moment she heard herself. The eyes going briefly wide, the recognition arriving a second too late, and the understanding that she had just spoken her own verdict aloud in front of every elder in the territory. The clearing breathed. Nolan said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Brevin had been standing at the far edge of the crowd since the trial began. She hadn't looked at him directly. Hadn't needed to. She'd known he was there by the way the bond space where he used to exist felt hollow and distant. Nothing between them anymore. Just air. Now she looked. He was already moving. He crossed the sacred ground slowly, his head bowed, and stopped 3 paces in front of her. He didn't look up for a long moment. When he did, his eyes were not the cold, flat eyes of the ceremony. They were the eyes of someone who has had 4 weeks to sit with what he did and has not managed, even once, to make it feel acceptable. And he dropped to his knees. Not a performance. His knees hit the dirt and he stayed there. And when he spoke, his voice was stripped of every layer of alpha authority he'd spent his whole life building. "I was a fool," he said. "I was blind, and I was weak, and I let something poisoned into my head because I was too proud to question it. I rejected my destiny for a lie I chose to believe." He paused. "I am sorry. I will carry what I did in this clearing for the rest of my life. I don't ask you to forgive me. I only needed you to know that I know." He lowered his head again. Elowin looked at him. She waited for the old pain, the 2-year ache, the specific grief of being seen and then unseen, the thing that had kept her warm and cold in equal measure. She waited for it to return in the face of his remorse, to reanimate itself now that there was something to push against. It didn't come. There was nothing left there. Not anger, not satisfaction, not forgiveness, which requires warmth. And what she felt toward him was simply absence. The clean, final emptiness of someone who has moved beyond the reach of old pain. He was part of a story she used to be in. She was in a different story now. She looked away. Then Vianne was in front of her. She hadn't run. The guards would have stopped her. But she'd moved, crossing the sacred ground with her knees already bending, her hands reaching for Eloin's dress. The midnight blue velvet caught in her fingers. She was on the ground, and her composure was entirely gone, and what was left underneath it was something raw and small and frightened. "Please," she said. "Addie, I'm your sister. I've always been your sister. I was jealous. I was so jealous of you, I didn't know how to. I made terrible choices, and I'm so sorry. Please." Eloin looked down at her. She stood there and she looked at her sister's face. At the calculation finally stripped away. At the person underneath it. And she recognized her. She recognized the jealousy that had never found a healthy shape. She recognized the fear of being less than that had driven Vianne to destroy rather than grow. She recognized it because she had spent 18 years on the other side of it. She reached down. Vianne's breath caught. Hope flooded her face. Eloin took her sister's fingers from the velvet, one by one. Carefully, completely. She removed each hand from her dress with the deliberate quiet of someone closing a book they have finished reading. And she straightened up and took one step back. "You are not my sister," she said. Her voice was quiet, and it was final, and there was no theater in it. "You are the reason I found my destiny. I almost pity you for that." She turned away. She didn't look back. She had stopped looking back at things that were behind her. She walked toward Nolan. He was watching her from the center of the clearing, and the expression on his face was entirely his own. Not the king's expression, not the judge's, not the cold gold mask of a man conducting a public trial. Something else. Something private. Something that moved in the hard lines of his face the way light moves in deep water. Only visible if you know how to look. Only visible to someone standing close enough. He reached for her hand. She gave it. Their fingers locked together, and the bond blazed between them, warm and golden and alive, visible in the night air as a soft radiance at the curve of her neck, pulsing gently with the rhythm of two heartbeats finding the same tempo. It didn't need to be announced. It didn't need to be displayed. It was simply there, between their joined hands, in the cold mountain air, in the clearing where her life had been broken open and rebuilt into something she hadn't known to dream. He looked at her. "My queen," he said, low. For her. Only for her. Then, in front of every elder and pack wolf and allied representative in the Thornridge clearing, Nolan tilted her chin up. His eyes asked a question and her answer was in the way she didn't look away. He kissed her. Not performatively. Not as a statement for the crowd. Not as a political gesture or a power display. As a man who has waited centuries for something real. As a man who is finally sure. The clearing was absolutely still. The moon hung pale and patient above them. The torches burned. The cold mountain air moved through the pines at the edge of the territory and carried the smell of pine smoke and cold earth out into the dark. And Eloin, the rejected Omega of the Thornridge pack, the girl who had stood at the back of the clearing in a clean white dress and shaking legs and believed with her whole heart that she was finally going to be chosen, held the Alpha King's hand and breathed, and was warm. She had been right that night. She had been chosen. She had simply been wrong about who was doing the choosing. When they walked out of the clearing, they walked together, his hand in hers, his mark glowing gold at her neck, and the assembled packs watched her go. The Thornridge wolves watched the girl they had overlooked walk out of their clearing as their queen. The elders lowered their heads as she passed. Even Tavian, standing at the tree line, inclined his head with something approaching respect. At the very edge of the crowd, pressed back between two tall pines with both hands still covering her mouth, Serena Ashenford watched them go. She was crying openly. Not quietly, not carefully, but fully and freely. The kind of tears that have been building for months and have finally found their occasion. She was smiling so wide it looked like it hurt. The clearing fell still. The moon watched from above, pale and patient and ancient, as if it had always known. From the moment a girl stood at the back of this clearing with a quiet warmth in her chest and a hope she didn't dare name. Exactly how this story would end. Elowyn did not sleep easily that first week at the Ironhold. The rooms were enormous and cold in the way that ancient stone is always cold. Not uncomfortable exactly, but not the warmth of a house built for people who expected to be comfortable. The bed was larger than her entire childhood bedroom. The fireplace was the size of a doorway. The cold blue fire in the hearths burned through the night but gave off a warmth that was somehow theoretical, present in temperature but absent in feeling, like sunlight through glass. She would lie awake and listen to the mountain. The Ironhold had its own sounds, not the sounds of a pack house, and not the creak of wood and the distant noise of people moving through shared spaces. It had the sounds of stone, settling deep in the earth, like a living thing breathing in slow geological time. Wind, far above, moving across the mountain's peak. Somewhere in the deep corridors, the occasional footfall of the night guard, measured and patient. These sounds did not comfort her the way her old room's sounds had. They were too large. They were the sounds of something that had existed before her and would exist long after. But she was here. She was alive. She was warm, even in the cold. The bond pulsed gently in her chest. Steady, steady. A heartbeat that was not hers, but that her own heartbeat had already begun to match. And she would press her palm against her sternum and feel it and remind herself of the facts. This is real. He chose you. The goddess saw you. She said this to herself in the dark until it became less surprising and more simply true. During the days, she explored. Tavian assigned her a guide, a quiet, older Omega named Arlena, silver-haired and precise, who had served the Ironhold for 30 years, and who showed Elowyn the corridors and the archives and the protocols with the calm efficiency of someone doing their job, and the careful watchfulness of someone deciding whether to respect the new queen or simply tolerate her. By the third day, Arlena had begun to answer her questions before she finished asking them. By the fifth day, she had begun to offer information Elowyn hadn't known to ask for. He doesn't take meals in the hall, Arlena told her, leading her through the east corridor toward the archive rooms. He never has. And he eats where he works, which is most often the study or the map room. If you want to find him, those are the places. A pause. He doesn't sleep much either. I don't think he needs it the way younger wolves do. The guard changes at midnight, and he's often still in the map room. Does he ever stop? Elowyn asked. Arlena considered. He stops on the balcony, she said finally. Sometimes just for a few minutes. He stands there and looks at the mountains. I think they're the only things old enough to feel like company. Elowyn thought about this for the rest of the day. That night, she went to the balcony. He was there, as Arlena had said, standing at the stone railing, not looking at anything in particular, just present in the way that only very old things manage, unlike a tree that has stopped needing to justify its existence to the weather. He heard her coming. He didn't turn. She stood beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and the cold air moved between them, and the bond pulsed warmly in the space between their separate thoughts. Do you come here every night? She asked. Most nights. A pause. Old habit. The mountains were here before the Ironhold was built. Reminds me of the order of things. She looked at the mountains. What order? That things that endure don't need to be loud about it. He was quiet for a moment. Most power announces itself. Mountains simply stay. She thought about that. about the years she had been quiet in the back of the clearing, in the back of every room, in the back of every conversation, and about whether her quietness had been weakness or simply endurance in a different form. She thought about the way the bond had stayed warm in her for 2 years, not demanding anything, just present, not loud, just staying. "I think I understand that," she said. He looked at her then. She felt it before she saw it. The shift of his attention, the weight of those gold eyes. "I know you do," he said. "It's one of the first things I understood about you." She turned to meet his gaze. The cold air was between them, and the bond was warm, and something in the space had changed, grown smaller. The distance that had existed between them in the days since the clearing narrowing in the way that only happens when two people stop being careful at the same moment. "What else?" she asked quietly. "What else did you understand?" He was silent for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, that you had been told for so long that you were small, that you had started to believe it as a fact instead of as someone else's failure of sight. His voice was entirely even. "I was angry about that. I have been angry about it since the clearing." She felt the truth of it in the bond. The way it carried his emotions when he allowed it to. The faint resonance of something that was still simmering, not toward her, but for her. "You can't be angry about someone's whole life," she said. "I can be whatever I choose," he said, and there was the ghost of something almost dry in it, almost wry, that she was beginning to learn was his version of warmth. "I'm very old. I have developed opinions." She laughed. That it surprised her. Small, genuine, the sound of something that had been locked in a tight space finding room to breathe. He looked at her when she laughed. Something moved in his face. Slow and private, too old and too deep to be called simple. "There," he said. "That." "What?" "You should do that more." He looked back at the mountains. "You have been so careful since you arrived, managing how much space you take up, deciding how much you're allowed." He paused. "You are the queen of this court. You are not required to be careful." She was quiet for a moment. "Old habit," she said. She meant it as a small joke, but it landed as something truer, and they both heard it that way. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but was thoughtful. Two people with old habits sitting in the dark and understanding each other across the distance of very different histories. When he left, he didn't say goodnight. He simply went. But he paused at the doorway, briefly, without turning back, and the bond pulsed once. Warm, deliberate, like pressing a hand against a wall to feel the warmth of it. She stood on the balcony for a long time after. She was not afraid of the dark. She was not afraid of the cold. She was not afraid of the vast permanence of the mountains. She was beginning to understand that she had never really needed to be afraid of those things. She had only been told she was too small for them. She was not too small. She was exactly the right size for the life that had been waiting for her. Serena Ashenford had known since the morning that something was wrong. She hadn't said so, because Elowyn did not need doubt on this night, and because Serena's gift was not certainty, but observation. And what she had been observing for 2 weeks was the specific way Brevin Ironshade moved through the packhouse. Too deliberately. Too casually. The way of a person performing normalcy rather than living it. She had noticed the conversations that stopped when she walked into rooms. The way Vianne had been unusually present at the packhouse in the 2 weeks before the ceremony, which was unusual because Vianne avoided the packhouse when she could, preferring the ranked wolves' quarters near the training ground, and the way their mother had looked at Vianne the morning of the ceremony. Not with the pride of a woman whose daughter was nervous and beautiful, but with the guilt of a woman whose daughter has told her something she cannot undo. Serena had noticed all of it. She had told herself she was wrong. Standing at the back of the clearing now, beside the space where Elowyn had stood until her name had been called, Serena felt the evidence of her own observations settle into her stomach like stone. She watched Brevin's eyes go cold and flat before he spoke. She watched the clearing gasp. She watched Elowin go down, and the sound it made in her chest was the sound of something irreplaceable being broken, and she made a noise she hadn't planned to make. She pressed her fist against her mouth. She watched Vianne step forward in her prepared dress with her practiced walk and her small, terrible smile. And Serena felt something she almost never felt. A cold, clean anger. The kind that does not burn hot, but burns long. She watched the pack applaud. She watched it die. She watched the shadow descend from the platform. And then... And she would tell this story for the rest of her life. At fires, in kitchens, to children who hadn't been born yet. She watched a king kneel in the dirt beside her best friend. And she understood, in the way you understand things that are too large to be processed all at once, that the story she had been afraid of watching end was not, in fact, ending. It was turning a page. She pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed through her nose and let the tears come. And she did not try to stop them, because some moments deserve to be felt fully, and this was one of them. When Elowin walked out of the clearing with the Alpha King's arm beneath her hand, Serena watched every step. She memorized the set of Elowin's shoulders. Straight, final, carrying nothing that wasn't hers by right. She memorized the way Elowin did not look back. She memorized the glow at her neck and the gold of his presence beside her, and the way the guard formed around them like a tide around a ship. She stood at the edge of the crowd long after the clearing had begun to murmur and shift. She was still smiling. I knew it, she thought. I always knew it. Not the king. She hadn't known the king. But she had known Elowin. She had known, for 18 years, that the girl standing at the back of every room with her chin up and her hope intact and her quiet, a stubborn refusal to be extinguished, was not someone the world would be allowed to overlook forever. Eventually, the world would have to look. Tonight, it had looked. Serena went home through the pine forest, alone, under the pale crescent of a regular moon, and she was the happiest she had been in years. The Thornridge clearing was empty by dawn. The allied packs had dispersed through the night. The elders had returned to their territories. The Thornridge wolves had retreated to the packhouse with the quiet heaviness of a community that has witnessed something large and is not yet sure what it means for them. The torches had burned down to nothing. The sacred ground was just ground again. Elowin walked it alone, early in the morning, while Nolan met with Tavian and the allied representatives in the pack elders' hall. And she had asked for an hour, and he had looked at her for a moment, that measuring, gold-eyed look, and then nodded once and let her go. Zarek followed her at a distance, close enough to be present, far enough to be invisible. She walked the center path of the clearing. Cold grass under her feet. Cold air. The smell of pine and frost, and the faint ghost of wood smoke from the ceremony fires. She stopped at the center, right where the fire circle had been, right where she had stood before Brevin, and felt the bond tear. Right where Nolan had knelt. She stood there for a while. She thought about the girl who had stood here a month ago. Frightened and hoping and 18 years old and believing with her whole heart that tonight was the beginning. She had been right about that. Just wrong about the shape of the beginning. And she looked down at the ground. There was still a mark in the earth where someone's knee had pressed. Faint, barely visible. The packed ground slightly more compacted in a small oval. It might not have been his. It might have been from the ceremony itself, from Elder Jorvik, from any of a dozen people who had stood here through the night. She thought it might have been his. She pressed the toe of her boot against it gently. She stood there, and the cold air moved through her hair, and the bond pulsed warm and steady in her chest. She thought about Vianne, not with anger. She had said what she needed to say in the clearing, and it had been complete and final, and there was nothing left to add. She thought about her with something closer to sorrow. Not the grief of lost love, but the grief of lost potential. For someone who had all the pieces of a person and could not find a way to arrange them into something that didn't hurt everyone nearby. She thought about Brevin, briefly. His face in the dirt. his voice stripped. She thought, "I forgive you for being weak." She couldn't say it aloud yet. It would take more time to become a sentence and not just a feeling. But the feeling was there, which meant the sentence would come eventually. She thought about Serena and felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the bond. She would send for her. She had already decided. She would send a formal summons with a royal seal, which Serena would almost certainly find hilarious, and Serena would come to the Ironhold, and they would sit on the cold stone balcony and look at the mountains, and Elowyn would finally have someone to tell. She thought about the balcony. She thought about the night before the letter arrived, the warmth of it, the quiet certainty, his thumb against her knuckles. She thought, trust him. She had. And he had been right. She looked up at the pale morning sky. The sun was just cresting the mountains to the east, washing the clearing in gold. Not the gold of ceremony fires or torchlight, but real gold, natural gold. The gold of morning that has no agenda and no performance, and simply is. She stood in it. She breathed. Then she turned and walked back toward the tree line where Zarek was waiting at a polite distance, and she kept walking. Back through the pines and down the road toward the Pack Elders' Hall where Nolan would be waiting. And she did not look back at the clearing. She had no reason to. Everything that mattered was ahead of her.